Hello, today is Wednesday, March 6, 2019. I'm Joe Schmidt with TC2, and this is Staying Connected. Last week, there were two interesting stories in the news. One about Windstream, a Tier 2 service provider that some of you may use, and another about AT&T. In my view, the news is probably not good news for enterprises, but let's discuss it with two of my colleagues. I'm joined on today's podcast by Deb Boehling, a partner at LB3, and Keith Cook, a fellow project director at TC2. Thanks, guys, for joining me. Keith, let me start with you. This Windstream story caught many by surprise. What happened?
Well, Joe, Windstream filed for bankruptcy last Monday, February 25th. This was largely due to an unfavorable court ruling related to hedge fund Aurelius Capital's lawsuit against Windstream. The suit claimed that Windstream's spinoff of their fiber optic cable network 2 years ago was a violation of debt covenants for one of its bonds because it took away assets that backed the bondholder's investment. The hedge fund was awarded over $310 million, but more importantly, Windstream's hefty load of bond payments was accelerated. The bankruptcy court did allow Windstream to access up to $400 million of its $1 billion in Citibank financing for the purposes of continuing, quote, business as usual. But how much of that will be allocated to ongoing operations and to bidding in the FCC's millimeter wave spectrum for 5G remains unknown. Windstream has $5.6 billion of debt and loan maturities in 2020. The FCC is only interested in this impact on Windstream customers' 911 services, but that's not all they should be concerned about.
It's important as folks are thinking about the Windstream bankruptcy that this is not a Chapter 7 bankruptcy. This is a Chapter 11 bankruptcy. In a Chapter 11 bankruptcy, Windstream is allowed to restructure and to reorganize its debt so that it can continue its operations, a little along the business as usual, as Keith just mentioned. In a Chapter 11 bankruptcy, Windstream is allowed to restructure and reorganize its debts. It's not a Chapter 7, which implies a liquidation of assets. It's not like someone's going to throw a switch that abruptly turns your services off. Indeed, the bankruptcy announcement from Windstream sought to quell customer fears with assurances like, we intend to serve our customers as usual and to maintain relationships with our vendors and our business partners. And then one of those business partners was the leaseback entity, that REIT that got into trouble. Of course, what Windstream now does is controlled by a bankruptcy court judge and a bankruptcy trustee who may or may not feel the same about bankruptcy as usual. The other thing is the REIT that was spun off by Windstream that started this whole mess. And the financial groups are saying that the Unity Group, which is the REIT, their shares are being downgraded as well because Windstream was its greatest customer. So there seems to be a little bit of a domino effect going on from this unfortunate court ruling. Sources also say that Windstream's battle isn't necessarily over, but while the reasons, background, and even future court actions are interesting for sure, they don't detract from what has happened. So what does an enterprise customer do now? Windstream has a significant amount of consumer voice and internet business in rural areas, much of that funded through those hefty USF payments corporations make. But it also has a not insignificant amount of enterprise business. And those are the folks on this podcast that are probably most interested. If you're a Windstream customer, Windstream's bankruptcy particularly is not insignificant to you.
So, Deb, what do you do if you're a Windstream customer?
Well, Joe, it's important for people not to act like a chicken with their head cut off. First of all, you need to think about some of the background for a Chapter 11 bankruptcy. The idea, and what I mentioned about the debtors and the bankruptcy trustees, is that the idea is that the debtors and the bankruptcy trustees are authorized to assume or reject executory contracts. An executory contract is one that hasn't yet expired. So for those of you that may have Windstream contracts that still have a term to go, that's where your contract comes in. And this reflects the underlying policy that the bankruptcy court is trying to have the ability for Windstream to abandon its burdensome contract and retail beneficial contracts. You probably don't have a contract that is so beneficial they want to walk away from it, so you should feel a bit comforted. So once you know some of that background, what should you do? The first thing you should do is a very careful review of your contract. You should look at everything, not just the master agreement, but all of those service-specific schedules, particularly those that are most important to you. And Keith will talk to you a little bit later about how the particular services and mitigation factors come in. In most cases, the contract you have will continue to be valid during the bankruptcy process. It is unlikely to be abandoned, as I mentioned before, but there are some key exceptions, and you need to look at your contract language carefully. You want to look first for any termination rights. When you look at those termination rights, it's probably not something you want to do, but it's also something that if it has a bankruptcy termination clause, that clause is unlikely to be enforceable. So don't have perhaps your senior execs claiming, let's just go, let's tear out the services and move on. That's not going to work. So don't jump ahead. Look instead at gathering information during the bankruptcy process. So if your termination rights have things like poor performance or material breach or performance metrics that Windstream is supposed to be meeting, or if there are support requirements or account personnel, keep track of those things and watch what happens while Windstream is in the bankruptcy process. Those will be helpful if Windstream emerges from bankruptcy, which we all expect it will. Those facts will be very helpful should you desire to leave Windstream at that point in time.
And if your account support suffers, get familiar with Windstream's enterprise support portal, as well as their telephone-based customer support. Also, you should contact your account team if they haven't already contacted you, and they certainly should have. You want to have an honest dialogue with them, ideally in a face-to-face meeting. Keep your management and senior executives informed as well. Sometimes, if based solely on what they hear in media soundbites, they may not understand the implications. This is serious for sure, but the sky probably is not falling. Remind those execs of the multiple telecom-related bankruptcies of the past, from Global Crossing and WorldCom back in 2002 to Avaya just in late 2017, and many others in between. McLeod, Exo, Covad. Sadly, this is not some new precedent. Assure your management that you are proactively on this. If you don't have a contingency plan or an exit plan, make one. Hopefully you won't need it, but it's better to have that and not need it than the reverse. Finally, you should consider getting advice from a trusted partner. For example, both LB3 and TC2 have lots of experience helping clients navigate issues just like this one.
All right, thanks for that, Keith. Now, the other bit of news from last week that we want to quickly touch on is that AT&T won a lawsuit against the Department of Justice related to its merger with Time Warner. Now, any lawsuit win is a good win for a defendant, but against the DOJ, well, I think that's a really big deal. So, Deb, what does this all mean?
Joe, this is a very big deal, but a lot of it has to do with the merger aspects. We want to talk about what telecom customers may be thinking out of this. I know in recent years I have had some enterprise customers come to me being very concerned and confused by the merger, particularly when they had deals with Time Warner Communications or Time Warner Cable or TW Telecom, and they wanted to know how is all this going to sort out. And I wanted to just say that, this merger definitely impacts customers and AT&T and Time Warner's operation, but it does not impact the TW Telecom or the Time Warner Cable entities who provide broadband services. But why are customers confused? If you're a person that is around my age, you have been around Time Warner probably since your childhood. You remember the cartoons running around in your head. But now, Time Warner is not what it was in the past. Time Warner at various times diversified its product. So before 1998, it was a media and a content property with those cartoons that I mentioned. They also, during their history, developed Time Warner Communications, and they included Time Warner Cable. In 1998, they spun off Time Warner Telecom, and it was a joint venture with Time Warner Cable to make things even more confusing. And then in 2009, it spun off Time Warner Cable. So by the time all of this sorted out 10 years ago almost, AT&T was left acquiring only Time Warner's media assets. So AT&T's acquisition of Time Warner was really just of the media and content company. It will not impact any services, any broadband services that you may have or that you may be familiar with in the past.
Keith, do you think that this is a bad thing for enterprises to buy network services from AT&T? I mean, there's only so much money for AT&T to invest in its businesses, and I worry those funds won't be going where our clients would benefit.
Well, that's true, Joe. Wireless is growing at AT&T, but not very much. And AT&T has a lot of competition there from Verizon and T-Mobile. AT&T's wireline business revenue has also declined the last few years. The growth for AT&T is coming from media, not telecom. So, considering this victory, I expect that's where AT&T will continue to strive to grow.
I agree with you, Keith. That was very interesting what happened, but it is going to divert AT&T's focus. In fact, yesterday in the news, their entire focus was on restructuring the Time Warner Entertainment division. And that is diverting their attention and their resources. We've seen many signs over the years that AT&T, along with Verizon and some of the other service providers, want to slim down their workforce. They want to focus on a business model that's not focused on the transport aspect that we've grown up with, but one that is becoming much more focused on AT&T's case, the content development in Verizon's and its various ad properties. And it's very different from what we and our customers have known for many years. So this is a time of growth for all of us and our thoughts and our focus on the vendors and the history.
Yeah, I also agree. I do think that AT&T will invest heavily in 5G wireless technology along with their media investments. But sadly, I think that landline may not see the type of focus that will benefit our clients. Okay, we are out of time. Thank you, Deb, and thank you, Keith, for joining me today. If you'd like to hear more about what's happening with Windstream and AT&T, or you have other ICT needs, you can contact Deb, Keith, me, or any of our LB3 and TC2 colleagues by giving us a call or shooting us an email. You can also stay current by checking out our websites or follow us on LinkedIn.